Star Walker Studios presents Dungeon Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional D&D podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 278 of Dungeon Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of dungeon mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 28 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. I've got a great show for you today. I'm going to be returning to my discussion of the Dungeon Master's Guide, continuing where we left off last time. Last time we talked about creating a monster. We just got into the creating quick monster stats. Also talked a little bit about modifying or reskinning an existing monster to get what you're looking for and save a bunch of time and effort. And today we're going to dig into creating a full monster stat block. So last week, creating quick monster creating quick monster stats was just a quick and dirty. You just want the basic gist of a monster. You want the basic stats, armor class, hit points, attack bonus, damage, things like that. But we didn't go into the nitty gritty of ability scores and individual saving throw bonuses and things like that. We just came up with something relatively simple that would serve a purpose in our game, but is not as fully developed as what we might see in the monster manual. So today we're going to talk about fully fleshing out a monster and coming up with everything for it, so your monster will be as complete as anything you find in the monster manual. Before we get into that, though, I have a couple things I want to let you know about. First of all, I have a blog post on my website that is a collection of the Sage Advice segments from the Dragon Talk podcast. So Sage Advice is where the rules lead, Jeremy Crawford, goes on the show and talks about the rules, talks about rules that people commonly forget about or get confused about or maybe don't understand, and digs into the nitty gritty of how those rules work, talks about corner cases and weird things that can happen with the rules. And also, and this is what I find most valuable, talks about their thoughts behind the rules and why they've designed the rules the way they have, kind of what the philosophy is behind it, what they're trying to accomplish, which is really helpful as a dungeon master if you're going to do some home brewing on your own, to not only understand how the rules work and how they interact with one another, but to also grok the thinking behind the rules and the philosophy behind the rules, because then you can much better go beyond those rules and come up with your own rules. If you understand that guiding philosophy, you can come up with a rule that is very similar, if not exactly the same, as what the folks at Wizards would have come up with. And that is helpful because there's less chances that this new rule you came up with will cause disruptions in your game or have unforeseen consequences. So yeah, I find that really helpful myself as a DM, and I think a lot of people do and will. However, those segments aren't on every episode of the podcast. They're kind of few and far between, but they have been doing them for a few years now. So there's quite a bit of content that's accumulated over time. And I return to those a lot and listen to those a lot, and found it to be a bit of a pain to find them on Wizards' website. So I made this blog post that has all of the Sage Advice segments, has the topic of each of the segments that they talk about, what they're talking about that week, has a link to the show notes on Wizards' website for that episode, so you can listen to it there and see their show notes. Also gives you the timestamp of when the Sage Advice segment starts, because it's not at the beginning of the episode. And finally, I have a direct download link for the MP3 if you just want to download it and listen to it on your device. You don't even have to go to the Wizard site if you don't want to. But the link is there if you want to go to the source and see their stuff. So yeah, I update that as new Sage Advice comes out. I just updated it last week. There's a new Sage Advice where they're talking some about some rules in the player's handbook. And yeah, it's basically the exact same thing I did a couple years ago in my first player's handbook discussion episodes. But yeah, you can hear Jeremy's take on that stuff on Sage Advice. So the two most recent Sage Advice, they've started going through the player's handbook. So that is a little redundant if you've listened to everything on my show, because I already covered that. And I don't recall them saying anything that I didn't say or mention. But all the ones before that are other topics, many of which I have not talked about on the show. And regardless, it's always great to get it from the horse's mouth. And again, Jeremy is the rules lead, so he's the authority when it comes to the rules of D&D and how they're supposed to work. So that's on my blog. You can find that at starwalkersheroes.com/blog. And just want to let you guys know that that's out there because it's a excellent resource for DM. So if you're a newer DM, or maybe you're newer to Dungeons and Dragons, or you just feel like you don't grasp the rules as well as you'd like, I highly recommend checking those out. It's a lot more entertaining than just sitting down and reading the player's handbook or the DMG. And I've really learned a lot from it, and I think you will too. Also want to let you know that to help everyone out, I hope a little bit in what little I can do in these trying times where many of us are having to stay at home and self-quarantine, I have put my latest D&D supplement, Adventures of Primordia, on sale on my website. It's currently 20% off. So you can check that out and save a little money. Tried to give the biggest discount I could without getting too crazy and yeah. And I also put the bundle that is 10% off. So I have a bundle of all three of my supplements. So if you haven't gotten any of them yet, you can get the bundle and save 10%. Or if you've gotten one or two of them already, or you just don't want to spend so much, you can get Adventures of Primordia and save 20%. So you can find those at starwalkersheroes.com/store. And thank you to everyone who buys a copy of my RPG supplements. I really appreciate it. And also that reminds me, I'm considering doing another supplement, and I'd really like to know what you all are looking for. So if you're in the market for a third-party D&D supplement, what kind of thing do you want? Are you looking for more adventures? Are you looking for more player character options? Things like subclasses, backgrounds, subraces, magic items, spells, feats, equipment, things like that. Are you looking for setting stuff like a full campaign setting, or just maybe an individual village or town or city, things like that? What are you looking for? What are you most interested in? So I've put up some polls. I posted one on Twitter. I posted one on our MeWe community, and I posted one on our Discord community. So you can head to either of those places and participate in the poll and let me know which you'd be most interested in, assuming you'd be interested at all. Or if you'd prefer, you can just shoot me an email at dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. I'd really like to do another supplement, but I want to do what people want, because I know there's a lot out there, especially on the DMs Guild. There's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of great stuff out there. So I don't really know. I thought I knew, but I don't think I know what people want. Do people need more adventures? Do people need more player character options? Do people need more setting kind of stuff? What do people want? What do people need? So yeah, please participate in the poll. And if you want something that you don't feel is well represented by the choices I made for you, then feel free to just comment on the poll and give me your suggestion. And I'm going to try to keep track of all that and try to figure out what I can do that the most people would want. So yeah, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. So I've actually done a few of those things already. So my first supplement, the Trickster's Labyrinth, is an adventure. The second supplement, Relics of Power, is a new type of magic item that I describe and tell you how you can create your own or convert other magic items in the game into relics, which relics are magic items that get more powerful as the player character wielding them gets higher level. And my third supplement, Adventures of Primordia, is a collection of player character options. So I guess I've done something of all those things I mentioned, except I haven't really done a full-blown setting supplement. So one idea or a couple ideas I've been kicking around is trying to do a supplement about either my city of Alondria or my village of Dianara's Rest, or maybe both, and developing those more and putting those into a format that you could consume. So yeah, let me know what you're interested in. Really love to hear from you. All right, so today we are returning to the DMG, returning to our discussion of creating monsters. So there are tons of monsters in D&D. We've got the actual monster manual, which is, the first place you want to go for monsters. If you're new to the game, that's the first kind of source of monsters you want to grab, is the monster manual. We've got Volo's Guide to Monsters, which has quite a bit more monsters in it, and also has some more extensive information about specific kinds of monsters like beholders and goblinoids, things like that, orcs. And then we have Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, which has yet more monsters and information on things like demons and devils and some of the races in D&D, like elves and dwarves and halflings and things like that. And then most of, if not all of the adventures and campaigns that Wizards puts out will have some new monsters included with those as well. So just what's been presented to us in 5th edition, we have a lot of monsters to choose from. And then there are even more monsters from previous editions of the game. There are also lots of monsters in Pathfinder, which would be very easy to convert over to D&D. So there's a lot out there for you to choose from, but sometimes you don't find exactly what you're looking for and you want to create your own monster. Of course, the easiest way to do that is to take a monster that already exists and just make a few minor changes to it and call it done. And if you can get what you're going for that way, that's definitely the way to go. And I talked about that in the last DMG discussion episode, which you can check out. So today what we're going to talk about is actually designing a full, complete monster from scratch, from the ground up, and, doing all the steps, adding all the bells and whistles, and coming up with a stat block for that monster that's just as detailed as what you would find in the monster manual. So let's get going. So if you want to follow along, I am starting on page 275 of the DMG. Where it says creating a monster stat block. So again, last week we talked about the creating quick monster stats. So that's definitely a prerequisite for this discussion today, because, we're going to be using that same process, just going more in depth. So if you're new to the show, I highly recommend that you go back and listen to, I believe it was episode 276, our last DMG episode. I'll have it linked in the show notes for this episode, where we talked about creating quick monster stats, because we're going to go through that same process today, just more in depth. All right, so the first step of this process is having your concept. What do you want your monster to be? Have that in mind to get you started. So we're just going to go through this step by step. So step one is the name. For me personally, this would probably be the last thing, but I guess it depends on the monster. Like some of the things you might come up with, you already know what you're going to call it. But I definitely, if you don't have a name for your monster, don't get hung up on step one. Keep going. You can always name it later. So yeah, you give the monster a name. I don't think there's much to say about that. If you want to read what they have there, go for it. Step 2 is size. So this is a bit simplified from earlier versions of the game. So in 5th edition, our sizes for monsters are tiny, small, medium, large, huge, or gargantuan. So medium is human sized. So if it's smaller than human size, you've got tiny and small. Small is like a house cat kind of size, and then tiny is even smaller than that, like a mouse or even smaller. We've got large, huge, and then gargantuan is the biggest size. In earlier editions, we had like colossal, but there's no colossal size. In 5th edition, gargantuan's is as big as it gets. So we pick a size, and the size of your monster is going to impact which hit die you use, which is really nice. Something I really like about the design of 5th edition. In earlier editions, I think, for instance, in 3rd edition, the hit die was tied to the monster type. So a dragon would have one kind of hit die, a demon would have one kind of hit die. And I like that in this edition, they just tied it to the size of the monster, which I think is going to be easier to remember. And I think kind of makes more sense. And it's just more elegant, I feel like, from a design point of view. So step 2, just pick the size and keep that in mind. Step 3 is type. So this is things like humanoid or fiend or aberration or whatever. So you can look at the monster manual. The beginning of the monster manual describes all the different types in the game. And yeah, it's pretty easy to figure out what type your monster would be. Just go through those types and see what fits the best. So maybe what the hell? Let's look at those. I just happen to have my monster manual right here. So let's look at our monster types. And again, I think a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, or it'll be pretty clear where your monster fits in this. So first we have aberrations, and this is on page 6 of the monster manual is where this starts. We have aberrations. These are truly alien beings. So basically aberrations are creatures that don't really fit into anything else. They're the really weird stuff, things that aren't anything like, for the most part, animals that you would see on Earth. So things like aboleths, beholders, mind flayers, slotty. So for me, aberration is usually what I make something if it doesn't really fit in any of the other categories. Aberrations will include all of your Cthulhu type stuff, but just the really weird stuff that doesn't really fit anywhere else. Next, we have beasts. So these are non-humanoid creatures that are natural creatures, natural parts of the fantasy ecology, which is not to say that they have to be a creature that exists in nature in the real world, but in your fantasy world, they would be considered a natural creature. Some of them may have magical powers, but most beasts are unintelligent and lack any society or language. So beasts would include all types of ordinary animals, things like dinosaurs, and also the giant versions of animals. Next, we have celestials. These are creatures from the upper planes. Many of them are servants of deities. They're good by nature. So, at least in the standard kind of vanilla version of the game, a celestial that is not good would be a rarity. So these are things like angels, coatls, Pegasi, things like that. Creatures from the upper planes. We have constructs. So these are creatures that are constructed, not born. So this is going to be your golems, creatures from the plane of Mechanus, however you say that, such as Modrons. So yeah, for the most part in D&D it's golems, but any kind of constructed creature like a robot or a clockwork or things like that, that's your constructs. Dragons are dragons. I think we all know what dragons are. But dragons also include things like wyverns and pseudo dragons. Then we have elementals. These are creatures from the elemental planes. So the actual elementals themselves, also things like the djinn and the ifrit, salamanders, things like that. So elementals are usually pretty clear because they're going to be really tied to a single element. We have fae. So these are creatures from the plane of fairy or the Feywild. And there are all kinds of fae creatures, things like dryads, pixies, satyrs, etc. Next, we have fiends. So fiends are what in previous editions we used to call outsiders. Outsiders were fiends and celestials, creatures from other planes. Also, I believe elementals were considered outsiders. They don't really use that term in 5th edition. But fiends are kind of like the celestials, only they're the evil version. So these are creatures from the lower planes, places like the Nine Hells, the Abyss, things like that, and include devils and demons and Yugoloths and stuff like that. Giants are their own class, which to me seems a little strange, but there you go. So giants are giants. Humanoids. So this is a pretty broad category. These are all your human-shaped peoples. So all of the player character races in your world, things like humans, dwarves, elves, stuff like that. Also things like the goblinoids, hobgoblins, bugbears, orcs, gnolls, lizard folk, kobolds, all kinds of stuff are humanoids. And then we have monstrosities. So, monstrosities and aberrations are kind of the catch-alls for me. If something isn't obviously one of these types, it's usually either a monstrosity or an aberration. So the monstrosities are a little bit more natural than the aberrations. They're a little less strange. They fit the world better. Aberrations often have this sense of they came from elsewhere, whether or not they did. They just are very alien, where the monstrosities are more similar to a natural creature, but just kind of dialed up to 11. So monstrosities are monsters in the strictest sense, frightening creatures that are not ordinary, not truly natural, and almost never benign. Some are the results of magical experimentation gone awry, and others are the product of terrible curses. So this includes things like owlbear, minotaurs, yuan-ti, things like that. Now, sometimes it can be confusing, like the distinction between humanoids and monstrosities. Like, why are Minotaur a monstrosity and not a humanoid? I honestly don't know. So sometimes you're just going to have to make a judgment call with some of these things. And so if you're in a situation like that, maybe you've created a monster and you're not sure if it's a humanoid or a monstrosity, I would just look at the examples and ask yourself, or even a fae. Is it a fae? Well, fae is usually pretty clear because it'll have some tie to the plane of fairy. But yeah, trying to decide between a humanoid or a monstrosity, I guess ask yourself, is this closer to a minotaur, which would be a monstrosity, or a yuan-ti, which would be a monstrosity, or is it closer to like a goblin or a dwarf, which would be a humanoid? And I guess, the commonality I'm seeing in the monstrosities that could be humanoids is they seem to have a strong kind of animalistic bent to them. So like the Minotaur is kind of like a cross between a person and a bull. Yuan-ti is kind of a cross between a person and a snake. So I guess that's why those are monstrosities, where, the humanoids, with some exceptions, aren't so much like that. Then we have oozes. Oozes are easy. Oozes and puddings. If you're dealing with an ooze, you're going to know it. Plants, again, pretty easy. If you're dealing with a plant, you're going to know it. And, keep in mind that there are plant creatures that are intelligent, that are mobile, that are humanoid in shape, etc. So it could still be a plant, even if it doesn't seem like a plant at first glance. And then we have undead. So those are your basic creature types. And for the most part, I think you can see that most monsters would be pretty easy to classify. Most of these types are pretty cut and dry. It's pretty obvious if something is a fae or an elemental or an ooze or a plant. There's just a few of them, like whether it's an aberration or a monstrosity or a humanoid, that could be a little, you're not sure. But again, in those cases, I would just look at monsters in the monster manual and see, what's the thing that's closest to what you're creating, and what did Wizards classify that is, and classify that as. So yeah. So there's the types. All right. So tangent over. Going back to our DMG. So step 3 was deciding on its type, which again is going to impact its hit die. Or no, it's not going to impact its hit die. Its size impacts its hit die. Type is going to come into play with some other stuff that we'll talk about later. Step 4 is alignment. So give your monster an alignment if that matters to you or your game. I know some people don't use alignment at all, or some people like me, alignment is pretty kind of a tertiary thing. So for me personally, I don't honestly follow these steps when I make a monster. I do when we get to the more mechanical stuff. There's kind of a flow there, but I don't necessarily come up with the name first and then the size. I don't necessarily do it in this order. And a lot of times alignment is something I don't even think about until the very end, just to fill that blank. I might give it an alignment. But then some monsters you're going to know right away. Like if you're creating a demon, you're going to know it's chaotic evil probably right away. So with some monsters, you'll know the alignment is like one of the first things you know about it. Other monsters, you may not decide that till the end, or depending on how you approach D&D, you may not even give it an alignment, because you are like, every monster is going to be different. They don't all have the same alignment. So yeah. Step 5 is ability scores and modifiers. So monsters like your player characters have the 6 ability scores: strength, dex, con, charisma, all that. A monster can't have a score lower than 1 or higher than 30 in any of the 6 abilities. So just like your player character, a monster's score in a given ability determines its ability modifier. And it's the same as player character. So 10 is +0, 12 is +1, and so on. If you can't decide what a monster's ability score should be, look for a comparable monster in the monster manual and mimic their ability scores. For example, if your monster is roughly as smart as a human commoner, give it an intelligence of 10 +0 modifier. If it's as strong as an ogre, give it a strength of 19 +4 modifier. So there you go. Easy peasy. Step 6, expected challenge rating. Choose a challenge rating for your monster. So this is assuming that you have in mind what challenge rating you want this to be, which in fairness is probably going to be the case a lot of times, because you're designing an adventure, you're going to run your player characters through, you're coming up with an encounter, and you need a monster for the encounter. You have an idea for the kind of monster you want to create. And you also, because you're designing an encounter for your specific player characters, you probably have an idea of what kind of CR you're shooting for that monster. So that's probably a fairly common case. So, take note of what CR you want the monster to be, because that will kind of guide you through this process. If, however, on the other hand, maybe you just have an idea for a monster and you want to create it, and you don't really have a target CR. Maybe you just want to create the best representation of this idea of a monster that you have, and then its CR will be whatever it is. Then you don't have to have a CR in mind at this point. You can kind of discover it as you go through this process. And again, here they're calling it the expected challenge rating. So this is kind of a guide here at the beginning, but it's not necessarily the CR this thing's going to end up with when you're done. Step 7 is armor class. A monster's armor class has a direct bearing on its challenge rating and vice versa. So, there are things that, it's talked about in here. There are things about monsters that you can change around and they don't really affect the challenge rating. Things like the languages it can speak, or how many languages it can speak, its alignment, special senses like blind sight, dark vision, things like that in general don't affect the CR of a monster. But something that directly affects its combat ability, things like armor class, hit points, attack bonus, damage, those do affect the CR. So, if you have a monster with a higher armor class, it's going to tend to have a higher CR. If you give the monster a lower armor class, it's going to tend to have a lower CR. So there's different ways you can approach this. You can, as they say, use the table. So again, we're going to be using the same table that we talked about a lot last time, the monster statistics by challenge rating table, because I don't know why they try to make things as wordy as they can, I guess. Who says monster statistics or player character statistics? I was thinking about this when I was editing the last episode of this, because I'm using their terminology that they have in the book. And it's like, nobody says statistics. Like that in itself, I feel like is confusing because people are going to be like, what's a monster statistic? What is that? They're stats. That's what we all say, monster stats. So I don't know why they can't call this the monster stats by CR table instead of the monster statistics by challenge rating table. I suspect it's kind of like musicians. They like to try to sound smart by trying to use fancy words and jargon. But yeah, I'm not a fan of that. Make it easy to understand. That should be the most important thing. Monster stats. So I'm going to call this table monster stats by CR, if only because it's a lot less to spit out. And also because it says the same thing in less syllables. So why wouldn't I? But just keep in mind, when you look in the book, it's called Monster Statistics by Challenge Rating, which is a tongue twister by itself. So this table we're going to refer to a lot. So going back to our armor class, you can use this table. So you can choose an appropriate armor class based on the expected challenge rating that you decided on, as shown on the table. So let's say you've decided your monster is going to be around CR 10. If I look at CR 10 on the table, that calls for an armor class of 17. So I could just give my monster an armor class of 17 and call it good. So it says the table provides the baseline armor class for a monster of a specific CR. Feel free to adjust the armor class if you see fit. For example, the baseline AC for a challenge rating 1 monster is 13. But if your monster is well armored, raise its armor class accordingly. Don't worry if the monster's armor class isn't matching up with the expected challenge rating. There are other factors that will affect the challenge rating throughout this process. So the first way we could come up with the AC is we could use the table to guide us if we have an idea of what challenge rating we're shooting for. The other way we could approach it is just determine what the appropriate armor class would be. So you can determine an appropriate AC based on the type of armor the monster wears, its natural armor or some other armor class booster, such as the mage armor spell. Again, don't worry if the monster's AC isn't matching up with the expected CR on the table. So if your monster wears manufactured armor, its armor class is based on the type of armor worn, just like a player character's would be. If the monster carries a shield, apply the shield bonus to its AC as normal. So this works a lot with your humanoid monsters, things like goblins, hobgoblins, orcs. If you even look at those monsters in the monster manual and you look at their armor class, you'll see that armor class is coming from the armor that they're wearing, plus or minus their dex bonus, plus or minus a shield bonus, or plus a shield bonus if they have a shield, just like your player characters. They're using the same formula. So you can go that route if the monster wears armor. A monster that doesn't wear armor might have natural armor. In this case, it has an armor class equal to 10 plus its dexterity modifier plus its natural armor bonus. A monster with a thick hide, which is going to be a lot of your beasts, monstrosities, things like that. You're thinking, what makes this monster tough as far as armor class? And if your answer is, well, it has a thick hide, then you're looking at an armor bonus of +1 to +3 to their armor class. The bonus can be higher than this if the creature is exceptionally well armored. For instance, like a Gorgon, which has like almost a metallic hide, could have a higher armor. The Gorgon is covered in steely plates and has a natural armor bonus of +9. So that's quite a bit higher than +3. And again, you can look for monsters in the various supplements to find something that's close as far as the type of hide that you're looking for your monster and see what natural armor bonus they gave that monster and use that for your monster. And it's nice because when you look at a monster in the monster manual, it will tell you what those bonuses are. So let's look up the Gorgon in here. Let me find it real quick. Past all the giants and the goblins and the golems, we have the Gorgon. So we see armor class 19 and it says in parentheses natural armor. So that tells us that it is only getting an armor bonus from natural armor. And indeed, if you look at its dexterity, it has a +0 dex bonus. So we know its armor class is 19. It's only getting bonuses from natural armor. So we know that its natural armor bonus is +9 because it only starts with an armor class of 10 and then adds the natural armor to that, plus or minus a dex bonus. But this monster doesn't have a dex bonus. If it had a dex, I believe it will say, let me see if I can just real quickly find a monster that has a dex bonus. But I'm pretty sure it would say like natural armor, natural armor, dex. I think so. I'm not finding one with a dex bonus, but for instance, the Kuatoa has an armor class of 13, and it tells you those bonuses are from natural armor and a shield. So we know shield gives the +2 to armor class, so the Kuatoa has a +1 natural armor bonus. So I hope you can see how I'm figuring that out. So yeah, as far as armor class, you're either going to just look at an appropriate CR on your table and get an armor class that way, or if it's a creature that wears actual armor, you'll get to armor class from the armor that it's wearing with its dex. Or if it's a creature that relies on natural armor, you're going to use the guidelines here to figure out that natural armor bonus and then also the dex bonus. All right, step 8 is hit points. A monster's hit points have a direct bearing on its challenge rating. So this is one of the things that does impact challenge rating. So there's 2 ways to figure out the hit points that your monster has. First one is using the table. Again, this is the monster stats by CR rating table on page 274. So you can start with the monster's expected challenge rating and use this table to get the number of hit points. And it's going to give you a range. So again, if we're looking for a CR10 monster, we look on the table and it says that it will have somewhere between 206 and 220 hit points. So you just pick a number in that range and call it good if you want. Or you can assign hit dice. So instead of using the table, you can assign a number of hit dice to a monster, then calculate its average hit points. Don't worry if the hit points aren't matching up with the expected CR rating for the monster on the table. There are other things they say this over and over. So basically, don't worry about CR until you're done, because there's a lot of things here that are going to affect the CR, and we're not really going to know what the CR is until we're completely done. So a monster can have as many hit dice as you want, but the size of the hit die that's used to calculate hit points depends on the monster size, as shown on this table, hit dice by size on page 276. So a tiny monster has a D4 hit die, a small monster has a D6, a medium monster has a D8, a large monster has a D10, a huge monster has a D12, and a gargantuan monster has a D20. And this table also gives you the average hit points per die. So last week I told you how you can figure out what that is for any hit die. But if you don't even want to do that, you can just look on this table here on page 276, and it tells you that the average hit points for a D8 is 4.5 hit points, for example. So, for example, a medium monster uses D8 hit dice for its hit points. So a medium monster with 5 hit dice and a constitution of 13 with a +1 constitution modifier has 5d8 plus 5 hit points because it gets that constitution modifier for each hit die. So it has 5 hit die, has a +1 con bonus, so it gets +5 to its hit points, just like your player characters. All right, step 9 is damage, vulnerabilities, resistances, and immunities. So here you decide whether your monster has vulnerability, resistance, or immunity to one or more types of damage. Assign a vulnerability, resistance, or immunity to a monster only when it's intuitive. For example, it makes sense for a monster made of molten lava to have immunity to fire damage. So yeah, and that's a great way to approach this. Don't look to try to give your monster as many immunities, resistances, and vulnerabilities as possible. Just think, is there anything that leaps out at me about this monster that it would have? For instance, if you're making some kind of elemental creature, like they're talking about here with the, what was it? They don't give a monster, but like a fire monster, like a salamander type of thing, something from the plane of fire, it makes sense that it would have immunity to fire or at least resistance to fire. And it might have vulnerability to the opposing element. For instance, water. So maybe it's immune to fire, but it's vulnerable to water. Could be. So again, your concept will guide you there. And if there's something that just seems obvious, like, it's going to, have a resistance or immunity to a certain element or a certain type of damage, then do it. But if not, don't worry about it. Don't feel like you have to give it one of these things. Because remember, these things just make the monster more complex during play for you to run as a DM. So you definitely don't want to just assign them willy-nilly. Only do it when it makes sense to the theme of the monster. A common one here that you'll see a lot with especially higher CR monsters is resistance to slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning damage from non-magical weapons. So if you're looking at something other than a completely natural monster, something other than just a beast or a humanoid, if you're looking at fiends or celestials or elementals or fae or really any of the monster types other than humanoid or beast, and if it's a fairly high CR monster, then chances are really good it's going to have that resistance to non-magical damage from slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning. So with your higher CR, more magical monsters, you can just add that in and assume that they have it. Because remember, at that point in the game, your player characters are going to pretty much all have magical attacks of some form anyway. All right. Giving a monster resistances and immunities to 3 or more damage types, especially bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, which I just talked about, is like giving it extra hit points. However, adventurers have more resources at higher levels to counteract such defenses, making resistances and immunities less relevant at higher levels. So what this is saying is that these resistances and immunities and also vulnerabilities can impact the CR of the monster. However, that impact is more felt at lower levels of play than at higher levels, because once you get to a certain level in the game, it's kind of assumed that the player characters have magical attacks at that point, and they're going to be able to bypass the resistances anyway. So at that point, they don't really have much to do with CR anymore because they're not really going to matter. Because your wizard, if you're dealing with a monster that's resistant to fire, your wizard's going to have plenty of non-fire spells to choose from. If you have a monster that's resistant to non-magical damage from slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning, most of your player characters at that level, like say level 10 or higher, are going to have magical weapons or be using spells that are going to bypass that resistance anyway. So it doesn't really affect the CR because it doesn't make the monster any tougher in most situations. All right, so far this has been pretty easy, right? In fact, less involved and complicated than what we talked about last time. But now this is where things are going to get a little more complex, where we start talking about effective hit points. So do you remember in our last DMG episode when I was talking about creating quick monster stats, how we had two kind of scores for the monster that we were using to figure out its CR? We had the defensive challenge rating and the offensive challenge rating, which I abbreviate as DCR and OCR. Remember how those were numbers that we used to design the monster, but they're not numbers that we use beyond that. So they're not numbers that we ever use in play. They're only used when we're designing the monster. Effective hit points is the same kind of thing. So a lot of people get confused by this. So whenever we're talking about effective hit points, this is just a design tool to help us design a monster and figure out its approximate CR. As soon as the monster is built and we're done designing it, as soon as we're going to use it in an encounter, effective hit points no longer matter. They're only used for design. They have nothing to do with the monster's actual hit points when your player characters go to fight it. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to use effective hit points to adjust the defensive challenge rating of our monster. So this is where we start getting into really trying to dial in what is the CR of this monster we're creating. And basically, when you look at this system, when you look at what we did last time with the creating quick monster stats, if you go back to page 274, creating quick monster stats, and you go to step 4, final challenge rating, we're going to do this with the full stat block that we're doing today. We're going to do the same process. We're going to come back to the step 4 here, final challenge rating, where we figure out the defensive challenge rating and the offensive challenge rating, which is exactly what it says. Defensive challenge rating is how tough is your monster defensively, which really, for the most part, boils down to its armor class and its hit points. How hard is it to hit and how many hits can it take? So that tells you how tough it is defensively. And then we also look at how tough is the monster offensively, which in general terms is its attack bonus and its damage. Or if it's using magic, its spell save DC and its damage. So we're looking at how likely is the monster going to hit you with an attack, or if it's using magic, how likely are you going to be able to save versus the spell? And also, how much damage is it going to do to you if it hits you? So those are going to tell you how tough the monster is offensively. So we've got its defensive toughness, its defensive CR, and its offensive toughness, its offensive CR. How tough is it defense? How tough is it offense? And then we average those together to get its final CR. So we're going to do that exact same thing today, but it's just going to be a more involved process, where before the offensive CR was just based on attack bonus or spell save DC and damage per round, and the defensive CR was just based on armor class and hit points. Today, since we're going more in depth, we're going to have more things playing into the defensive CR and the offensive CR. But at the end of the day, we're still going to have two numbers. We're going to have a defensive CR and an offensive CR, and we're going to average those two numbers to get our final CR. But we're just having more come into play with how we figure out what that defensive CR and that offensive CR is. I hope that makes sense. So effective hit points is another thing that's coming into play to help us figure out our defensive CR. So if a monster has resistance or immunity to several damage types, especially bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical weapons, and not all the characters in the party possess the means to counteract that resistance or immunity, you need to take these defenses into account when comparing your monster's hit points to its expected challenge rating. And if we just pause there and we think about that for a second, that makes sense. Okay, so let's just talk about resistance. let's think about how resistance actually works mechanically. So let's say we're dealing with a monster who has resistance to non-magical damage from piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning weapons. And let's say that at least some or most of your player characters don't have magic weapons. So that resistance is going to be coming into play. Because again, if they all have magic weapons, then the fact that the monster has resistance to non-magic weapons doesn't matter. Do you see that? Because they're all using magic weapons, so it doesn't matter. But if they don't have magic weapons, then that means that every time they hit that monster, they're only going to be doing half the damage they normally would, because that's what resistance does. It divides the damage in half. So if I'm fighting something that's resistant to non-magic damage, like say a werewolf, and I hit it with my sword, that's just a normal sword, it's not magical, it's not silver, and I do 10 damage, the werewolf only takes 5 of that damage because it's resistant to my damage. So it only takes half. So I hope that you see how you could look at that as, in a way, it's like the monster has twice as many hit points, right? Because if you're only doing half the damage to it, it's going to take you twice as long to kill it as it would if you were doing full damage. So in a way, it's almost like the monster has twice as many hit points. So that's what they're saying here and that's our effective hit points is to show that or represent that in our CR calculation. The fact that, yeah, the monster has 100 hit points, but if you can't get through its resistances, it's almost like it has 200 hit points. I hope that makes sense. And again, the actual hit points of the monster aren't going to change. These effective hit points is just for design. This has nothing to do with the stats the monster's going to have at the end. It's just to help us figure out how tough the monster is and what its defensive CR should be. So for example, a monster with an expected challenge rating of 6, 150 hit points, and resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage from non-magical weapons effectively has 225 hit points, using the 1.5 multiplier for resistances for the purpose of gauging its final challenge rating. And you're like, wait a minute, Lex, where the hell did this 1.5 come from? Okay, so right here, right below this paragraph here, is a table that says effective hit points based on resistances and immunities. And that's where they got the 1.5. So you look at the table, and first we have different ranges of expected challenge rating, CR 1 to 4, CR 5 to 10, CR 11 to 16, or CR 17 or more. And we see, for example, a CR 1 to 4 creature, the hit point multiplier for resistances is ×2, and the hit point multiplier for immunities is ×2. And again, this should actually say effective hit point multiplier. That's kind of a lack of clarity there, or as I abbreviate it, EHP, effective hit points. So just remember that's what they really mean. You're not multiplying its actual hit points, it's effective hit points. So I believe this is the current printing of this. That's something they should really fix in later printings. That could be more clear. All right. So basically, if your monster has resistances and immunities to 3 or more, if it's less than 3 resistances or immunities, it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. But if it has 3 or more of those guys, and especially if those 3 are piercing, slashing, and bludgeoning weapons, you're going to use this table here to figure out how you're going to multiply its effective hit points. Okay. So let's take an example. So let's say we're making a CR 10 monster and it has 3 resistances. Let's say it's resistant to slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning damage from non-magical weapons. So it's got 3 resistances. And let's say it's CR 10. So hit points for CR 10, it's 206 to 220 hit points. Let's say it has 210 hit points. Okay. So we look on this table, we see expected challenge rating 5 to 10. Hit point multiplier for resistances, again, only if it has 3 or more, is ×1.5. So we take our hit points, which were 210, we times that by 1.5, which would be 315 effective hit points. Again, its hit points aren't changing. This is just effective hit points that we're using to figure out its defensive challenge rating. So you would write that down. EHP equals 315. All right, because we're going to come back to that in a bit. All right, so step 10 is attack bonuses. So in step 9, we were thinking about defensive challenge rating. Now in step 10, we're thinking about offensive challenge rating. A monster's attack bonuses have a direct bearing on its challenge rating. Okay, we can quit saying that. We know that. So again, there's two different ways you can figure out what your monster's attack bonus is. Way number 1 is you can use the table. So again, this is the monster stats by CR table. So you just look up the challenge rating you're shooting for your monster and see what attack bonus it gives you. So for instance, CR10 monster on the table calls for a +7 attack bonus. So it says the table provides the baseline attack bonus for each challenge rating. Feel free to adjust this bonus as you see fit to match whatever concept you have in mind. For example, the baseline attack bonus for a challenge rating 1 monster is +3. But if your monster needs more accuracy, raise its bonus accordingly. Don't worry if the monster's attack bonus isn't matching up with the expected challenge rating for the monster. Again, they say this over and over and over, the same thing. So if you remember what we did last time where we figured out the challenge rating and we went through the steps on page 274, we're going to go through those same steps at the end of this process. So you can change anything you want here. Just keep track of what you're doing. And then at the end, we're going to go through those steps on page 274 to figure out what its actual CR is. And then that will factor in all the changes you made. All right, so we could get our attack bonus from the table, or we could calculate what it should be. So you can calculate a monster's attack bonus the same way that you would with a player character. So when a monster has an action that requires an attack roll, its attack bonus is equal to its proficiency bonus plus its strength or dexterity modifier. A monster usually applies its strength modifier to melee attacks and its dexterity modifier to ranged attacks, although smaller monsters sometimes use dexterity for both. Again, I'm going to quit saying this. They say the same crap at the end of every paragraph. Don't worry about the CR. We're going to figure that out at the end. They keep saying that. So yeah, and again, you're going to get your proficiency bonus from the monster stats by CR rating table. All right. Step 11 is damage. A monster's damage output, the amount of damage it deals every round, has a direct bearing on its CR. So again, two methods. We can use the table. It's the same as everything else. We're going to look up its CR on the table and then look at its damage per round and give it a number in that range. Let's see. So the table presents a range at each challenge rating of damage. It doesn't matter how this damage is portioned out or distributed in the round. For example, a monster might deal the damage every round with a single attack, or the damage could be split among multiple attacks against one or more foes. Again, as I mentioned last time, when we're figuring the damage per round, we're just assuming that everything's going to hit. So again, I talked about how there is some secret sauce here. You're not, especially with more complex or more powerful monsters, you're not always going to get the same CR that wizards did, because there's more to this when they're designing a monster than what they're showing us here. They've simplified this a bit to make it easier for you. And also because for our purposes, the CR doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be close. So part of that special sauce, I imagine, I don't know, but part of that special sauce is probably not an assumption that every attack hits, because of course in play, every attack isn't going to hit. So I'm guessing they have some value other than one there as far as how many of the attacks hit or what percentage of the attacks hit. But for our purposes, we just assume everything hits. So, if you, I think that would come into play a bit more if you're considering, am I going to have my monster do one attack and do all that damage, or spread that damage over 3 attacks? When you're assuming every attack hits, then it doesn't matter. It's going to do the same damage no matter what. But if you're not assuming every attack hits, then it may have a different damage output based on the number of attacks, because the more attacks there are, the more that's going to come into play, because each attack, there's a chance it might miss. But again, we're not going to worry about that because that's deeper than we need to go for our purposes. So we just assume everything hits. So they're just saying, if you're using the table and you're saying, okay, my CR10 monster is going to do somewhere between 63 and 68 damage. Let's say I decide it does 65 damage a round. It could do that 65 damage with 1 attack, or I could split that up between 2 or more attacks, however I want. As long as the total damage is 65, it doesn't matter. Choose the type of damage based on how you imagine the attack being delivered. For example, if the monster is attacking with razor sharp claws, the damage it deals is probably slashing. If its claws are poisonous, some portion of the damage might be poison damage instead of slashing damage. So just what makes sense. If they're using a weapon, it's going to be whatever type of damage the weapon does. If it's some kind of elemental attack, it'll be whatever element. So if it's a breath of fire, then it's going to do fire damage. If you want the damage output to vary slightly from round to round, you can translate the damage range into a single die expression for a monster with 1 attack, or multiple die expressions for a monster with multiple attacks. And by die expressions, they just mean what are you going to roll for damage if you roll damage. So for example, a challenge rating 2 monster deals 15 to 20 damage per round. If you imagine the creature having a strength of 18 with a +4 strength mod, you could give it 1 melee attack that does 3d8 plus 4 damage for an average of 17.5 damage. Or you could split the damage output into 2 separate attacks that each deal 1d10 plus 4 damage for an average of 9 damage each. Or use any combination where the average damage output falls within the desired range. So you just want all the attacks to add up to that damage output that you're shooting for. So that's one way you can figure out the damage, using the table. Or you can base the damage on the weapon if the monster is using some kind of weapon. So don't worry. Again, they keep saying the same thing over and over. Don't worry about the CR. We're going to figure that out later. So some monsters use natural weapons such as claws or tail spikes, while other monsters wield manufactured weapons. If a monster has natural weapons, you decide how much damage it deals with those attacks, as well as the type of damage. So in this case, you can look at the monster manual, find something similar about the same size and CR that you're searching or shooting for, same monster type, and see what kind of damage they're doing. As far as the die, what kind of die are they rolling? And then you're going to add their strength bonus to the damage if it's a melee attack. If a monster wields a manufactured weapon, it deals damage appropriate to the weapon. For example, a great axe in the hands of a medium monster deals 1d12 slashing damage plus the monster's strength modifier, as is normal for that weapon. So just like you would with a player character. Big monsters typically wield oversized weapons that deal extra dice of damage on a hit. Double the weapon dice if the creature is large, triple the weapon dice if it's huge, and quadruple the weapon dice if it's gargantuan. For example, a huge giant wielding an appropriately sized great axe deals 3d12 slashing damage plus a strength bonus instead of the normal 1d12. So let's take the great axe example here. A medium great axe used by a medium creature would do 1d12 damage. A large great axe wielded by a large creature would do 2d12 damage. A huge great axe wielded by a huge creature would do 3d12 damage. And a gargantuan great axe wielded by a gargantuan creature would do 4d12 damage, plus whatever their strength bonus is. A creature has disadvantage on attack rolls with a weapon that is sized for a larger attacker. So, for instance, if you're a medium character and you're trying to use a large creature's great axe, you would do the 2d12 damage with that great axe plus your strength mod, but you would have disadvantage on the attack roll because the weapon is too big for you. You can rule that a weapon size for an attacker 2 or more sizes larger is too big for the creature to use at all, which I think makes sense. So as a medium creature, I could use a large creature's great axe, but I'm not going to be able to use a huge creature's great axe. I think that makes sense. All right, so for damage, we started with using the table or basing the damage on the weapon. Now we're going to talk about overall damage output. To determine a monster's overall damage output, take the average damage it deals with each of its attacks in a round and add them together. If a monster has different attack options, use the monster's most effective attacks to determine its damage output. So it's doing the most damage it can do. For example, a fire giant can make 2 greatsword attacks or 1 rock attack in a round. The greatsword attacks deal more damage, so that attack routine determines the fire giant's damage output. Again, we did this exact same thing last time with the quick monster stat. So a lot of this is the same, just with some added layers put in, some added steps, depending on your monster. If a monster's damage output varies from round to round, calculate its damage output for each round for the first 3 rounds of a combat and then average those together. And we talked about this last time too. So for example, let's say we have a young white dragon that has a multi-attack routine with 1 bite attack and 2 claw attacks that deals an average of 37 damage each round. So all of those attacks added together deals 37 damage. It also has a breath weapon that deals 45 damage or 90 damage if it hits 2 targets, and it probably will. And we talked about this last time too. It seems like with the breath weapons, they just assume it's going to hit 2 people. How they came up with that number, I don't know, but I guess we'll just assume the same thing. In the first 3 rounds of combat, the dragon will probably get to use its breath weapon once, and then will use its multi-attack routine for the other 2 rounds. So its average damage output for the first 3 rounds, you would first add the damage for the 3 rounds up. So 90 damage for that first round because it uses its breath weapon and hits 2 people. 37 damage for the second round because it's using its multi-attack. And then 37 damage for the third round. You add those 3 together and then divide by 3 to get the average of 54 damage per round. And that's what you would use to determine your offensive challenge rating, is 54 damage per round damage output. When calculating a monster's damage output, also account for special off-turn damage dealing features such as auras, reactions, legendary actions, or lair actions. For example, and they gave the exact same example last time, a Balor's fire aura deals 10 fire damage to any creature that hits the Balor with a melee attack. The aura also deals 10 fire damage to all creatures within 5 feet of the Balor at the start of each of the Balor's turns. If you assume that one character in the party is within 5 feet, again, how we assume that, I don't know. How they figure out to assume one character, I don't know, but that's what we'll do. If you assume that one character is within 5 feet of the Balor at all times, hitting it with a melee weapon every round, then the Balor's damage output per round increases by 20 because that character is taking 10 fire damage because it's hitting it with a weapon every round, and it's taking another 10 fire damage because it's just standing close enough to it every round. So it's taking an additional 20 damage every round. All right, so the next step 12, is save DCs. A monster might have an attack or some other trait that requires a target to make a saving throw. So again, we can use 2 different methods to figure out what the DC of that saving throw will be. We can either use a table, and again, we just look up the monster CR on the monster stats by CR rating table and see what save DC that CR should have and call it a day. Or we can calculate what the DC should be. So a monster save DC is figured the same way as a player character's. You take the number 8 plus the monster's proficiency bonus, plus the monster's relevant ability modifier. And that's their save DC. So you would choose whatever ability you think would fit best. For example, if the effect is a poison, the relevant ability is probably the monster's constitution. If the effect is similar to that of a spell, the relevant ability might be the monster's intelligence, wisdom, or charisma. Okay, I'm not going to say that again. We've said that enough. All right, step 13, special traits, actions, and reactions. Some special traits, such as magic resistance, special actions, such as superior invisibility, and special reactions, such as parry, can improve a monster's combat effectiveness and potentially increase its challenge rating. The monster features table lists various features from the monster manual and tells you how that's going to affect the challenge rating. So the way that these features can impact the challenge rating is they can increase the monster's effective armor class, their effective hit points, their effective attack bonus, or their effective damage output for the purpose of determining its CR. Again, these are only for the purpose of determining CR. It's not impacting its actual armor class, hit points, attack bonus, or damage output. It's just the effective that we're just using to figure out its CR. When assigning special traits, actions, or reactions to a monster, keep in mind that not all monsters need them. The more you add, the more complex and harder to run the monster becomes. We also have innate spellcasting and just plain old spellcasting. The impact that the innate spellcasting and spellcasting special traits have on a monster's challenge rating depends on the spells that the monster can cast. Spells that deal more damage than the monster's normal attack routine and spells that increase the monster's armor class or hit points need to be accounted for when determining the monster's final challenge rating. So for instance, if it has spells that do more damage than its attack, then you would figure that into its damage per round. So let's say the monster has a spell like magic missile that does more damage than its attack routine does. And let's say it can cast magic missile once per day, then you would use that for your damage calculation. So you do the 3-round average and say, okay, the first round, the monster uses magic missile. And in the second 2 rounds, it does its attack routine and average those damages. Or if it's mainly a spell casting monster and all of its damage is coming from spells, then you would choose the 3 most powerful spells it has, or the most damaging spells it has, and use those to average across the first 3 rounds of combat to figure out what its damage output would be. And also in those instances, if there are spells that call for saving throws instead of attack rolls, you would use the spell save DCs instead of the attack roll modifiers when figuring its offensive CR. All right, so this table that they're talking about is on the next page. It's on page 280 to 281. And so if you're looking for a special trait and it's not on this table, just assume that it doesn't affect the CR. So a big one that you'll use a lot probably is legendary resistance. So people often ask, if I just take a monster and make it legendary, like take a Medusa and make a legendary Medusa, what does that do to its CR? Well, it will increase its CR. And how you figure that out is you just go through this process that we're going to talk about here in a minute and that we talked about last time of figuring out its CR. And if you think about it, a legendary creature is going to have legendary actions, and some of those actions are going to be probably attacks. So that's going to increase its damage output, which is going to increase its offensive CR. Also, a legendary monster will probably have legendary resistance, which is going to impact its CR. We're going to talk about that here in a second. So it's going to increase its CR overall. It's going to be doing more damage due to legendary and or lair actions, which is going to increase its damage per round, which is going to increase its offensive CR. And it's going to have legendary resistances, which are going to increase its defensive CR. So if we look at legendary resistance on the table on page 280, the monster features table, we see that each per day use of legendary resistance increases the monster's effective hit points, not its actual hit points, just its effective hit points, based on the expected challenge rating. So if you're talking about a monster that's CR 1 to 4, it increases the effective hit points by 10. If you're talking a monster rating CR 5 to 10, it increases effective hit points by 20. And if you're talking about challenge rating 11 or higher, each use of legendary resistance adds 30 effective hit points. So if I'm talking about a CR 10 monster and I make it legendary and I give it legendary resistance 3 per day, then I look at CR 10 here. CR 5 to 10 gives 20 effective hit points. So 3 times a day, I'd take 3 times 20. So that having the legendary resistance 3 times per day for my CR 10 monster adds 60 effective hit points. That doesn't mean when I roll its hit points or I give it hit points for the player characters to fight that it has 60 more hit points. It just means it has 60 effective hit points when I look at how many hit points it has when I'm figuring out what its defensive CR is. Okay, let's look at another common one. Magic resistance. So if your monster has magic resistance, that increases the monster's effective armor class by 2. So if you give your monster magic resistance, when you go to figure its defensive CR, you're going to increase its effective armor class by 2, which means when figuring defensive CR, you're going to assume it has an armor class 2 higher than what you actually gave it. That does not mean its armor class is 2 higher when the players fight it. It's just effective armor class. Anytime you hear that word effective, whether we're talking effective CR, effective damage output, effective hit points, effective armor class, that word effective means that that's a number we're only considering when we create the monster to figure out what its CR should be. That effective number has nothing to do with the final stats of the monster. I really hope that makes sense. And I apologize if I'm just beating that like a dead horse, but it's really important that you understand that. And I see questions about that all the time. People thinking that increasing the monster's effective armor class means the final armor class is higher. And it's not. That's what that word effective means. It means it doesn't affect the final stats. It's just for figuring CR. So again, this table has all kinds of stuff like that, and you can look it up. And it also gives you example monsters that have that trait. So for instance, magic weapon or magic resistance, an example monster with that is a Balor, or the legendary resistance, an example monster with that is the ancient black dragon. All right, next is step 14, speed. Every monster has a walking speed. Immobile monsters have a walking speed of 0 feet. In addition to its walking speed, a monster might have one or more other speeds, including burrowing, climbing, flying, or swimming speed. Flying monster. If it's a flying monster, increase the monster's effective armor class by 2, not its actual armor class, if it can fly and deal damage at range, and if its expected challenge rating is 10 or lower. Higher level characters have a greater ability to deal with flying creatures. So yeah, if the CR is 10 or lower and it can fly and it can do damage at range, then you increase its effective armor class by 2 when figuring its CR. Step 15, saving throw bonuses. If you want a monster to be unusually resistant to certain kinds of effects, you can give it a bonus to saving throws tied to a particular ability. So normally a monster's bonus for a given save is just going to be whatever that ability bonus is. So strength save bonus will be whatever its strength bonus is. But you can give it, quote, good saving throws where it has a higher bonus than that. A saving throw bonus is best used to counteract a low ability score. So, for example, an undead monster with a low wisdom might need a wisdom saving throw bonus to account for the fact that it's more difficult to charm, frighten, or turn than its wisdom would indicate. A saving throw bonus is equal to the monster's proficiency bonus plus the monster's relevant ability bonus. So it's basically the same as a player character. You're just deciding that this monster is proficient in certain saving throws. And for those saving throws, you add in its proficiency bonus, just like you would with a player character. A monster with 3 or more saving throw bonuses has a significant defensive advantage. So its effective armor class, not its actual armor class, should be raised when determining its challenge rating. If it has 3 or more saving throw bonuses, increase its effective AC by 2. If it has 5 or more saving throw bonuses, increase its effective AC by 4. Step 16, final challenge rating. At this point, you have all the stats you need to calculate the monster's final CR. This step is identical to step 4 under creating quick monster stats. Calculate the monster's defensive challenge rating and its offensive challenge rating, then take the average to get its final challenge rating. So if we go back to step 4 under creating quick monster stats, this is on page 274. We talked about this last week, or 2 weeks ago. Last DMG episode, we talked about this in great detail. So please, if you haven't listened to that, go check that out. I go into this more there, but really quickly, we're going to tear through it again real quick. So to find the final challenge rating, we start with its defensive challenge rating. So we're going to start by reading down our hit points column of the table. And again, remember, if you've given your monster traits that gave it higher effective hit points that said increase its effective hit points, for instance, let's see, giving it legendary resistance is a trait that increases its effective hit points. Then when you're ready to figure its defensive challenge rating and you look up the hit points on the monster stats by CR table, you're going to look up its effective hit points, not its actual hit points. So you look up its hit points or its effective hit points under the hit points column on this table, and then go to the left and see what CR that is. Write that down. So if your monster has between 206 and 220 effective hit points, then it's a CR 10 for defensive challenge rating. Now, once we know that defensive challenge rating, we look on that line to see what the monster's armor class should be. And again, if you've done something that increased the monster's effective armor class, for instance, giving it magic resistance increases its effective armor class by 2, then you use that effective armor class number here. All right, so my monster is CR 10. I look at armor class, it should be 17. So let's say I gave my monster a 17 armor class, but its effective armor class is raised by 2 because I gave it magic resistance. So it has an effective armor class of 19. It's actually 2 higher than the 17 it's calling for here. For every 2 higher or lower than this armor class your effective armor class is for your monster, you increase or decrease the defensive challenge rating by 1 accordingly. So in my example, my effective armor class for my CR10 monster is 19. That's 2 higher than 17. So I add +1 to my defensive challenge rating. So my defensive challenge rating for my monster goes up from 10 to 11. So for every 2 points, your armor class is higher than what the CR calls for on this table, you add 1 to the defensive challenge rating. Or if it's lower, for every 2 points, the CR is lower than that, or I'm sorry, for every 2 points, the AC is lower than the AC for your CR, you would decrease your defensive challenge rating by 1. If it's only 1 higher or lower, it doesn't affect it. It's only in increments of 2. All right, so now you have your final defensive challenge rating. Then we find our offensive challenge rating. To do this, we look down our damage per round table, or damage per round column on this table, and we find out what our offensive CR is. Now, again, if you have anything that is impacting this, your effective damage, then you would factor that in and use your effective damage, not the actual damage. So some traits you give your monsters can increase their effective damage. Now, once you have your offensive CR based on your damage output, you look over to see what the associated attack bonus or save DC, depending on whether your monster is mainly using attack rolls or relying on saving throws by the player characters, to see what that should be. So if the monster's attack bonus, it's the same as the AC. If it's 2 or more higher or lower than what this is asking for, then you're going to increase or decrease the offensive challenge rating by 1 for every 2 points it's higher or lower. And again, if it's using attacks or if it's using more spells that use saving throws instead of attack rolls, you're going to look at the spell save DC instead of the attack modifier here. So if I look at a CR10 monster, so let's say I look up my damage per round and it's somewhere, 60, let's say it's 65 damage per round. I looked at the CR10 monster. So if I'm using attack rolls, a CR10 monster should have a +7 attack bonus. So if my attack bonus is 2 or more higher or lower than +7, then I'm going to adjust my offensive CR accordingly. Or if it's a monster that uses more spells that uses saving throws like lightning bolt and fireball and stuff like that, then I'm going to look at the save DC, which for CR10 should be a save DC of 16. So if my save DC is 2 or more higher than 16, then I'm going to increase the offensive CR by 1 for every 2 higher that my save DC is. So now that I have my final offensive CR and my final defensive CR, I average those two numbers together. So I add those two numbers together and divide by 2 to get my final CR for my monster. All right, but we're not quite done yet. Step 17 is skill bonuses. If you want a monster to be proficient in a skill, you can give it a bonus equal to its proficiency bonus on ability checks related to that skill. For example, a monster with sharp senses might have a bonus on wisdom perception checks, while a duplicitous monster might have a bonus on charisma deception checks. You can double the proficiency bonus to account for heightened mastery, kind of like what rogues have. So for example, a doppelganger is so good at deceiving others that its bonus on charisma deception checks is equal to double its proficiency bonus plus its charisma modifier. So it'd be just like a rogue or a bard that has expertise in that skill. You'd figure it the same way. Skill bonuses have no bearing on a monster's challenge rating, which is why we didn't even worry about them before we figured out the CR, because they don't matter for CR. Step 18 is condition immunities. A monster can be immune to one or more debilitating conditions, and these immunities have no bearing on its challenge rating. So you can find the conditions in Appendix A of the player's handbook. And they say, as with damage immunities, condition immunities should be intuitive and logical. For example, it makes sense that a stone golem can't be poisoned since it's a construct without a nervous system or internal organs. So just like what we talked about with the damage immunities, when it comes to condition immunities, if there's something that seems like it makes sense and it seems obvious and like it really fits, give it that, but don't feel like you have to go looking for them, because they are going to make your monster more complex and more challenging to run. So don't give them out unless it really needs them. Step 19 is senses. Your monster might have special senses like blind sight, dark vision, tremor sense, or true sight. These have no bearing on challenge rating. Passive perception score. All monsters have a passive wisdom perception score, which is most often used to determine whether a monster detects approaching or hidden enemies. And this is figured the same way as with a player character. It's the monster's, it's 10 plus the monster's wisdom modifier. If it's proficient in perception, and then you also add its proficiency bonus to figure out its passive perception. And then step 20 is languages. Whether a monster can speak a language has no bearing on the CR. A monster can master as many spoken languages as you want, although few monsters know more than one or two, and many monsters, beasts in particular, have no spoken language whatsoever. A monster that lacks the ability to speak might still understand a language. We also have telepathy. This has no impact on the CR, but you can give it telepathy. And that's it. We have gone through all the steps of creating a monster. So assuming that you followed along the last Dungeon Master Guide episode and you grokked all that and you understand how to figure the offensive challenge rating and the defensive challenge rating and then averaging those together to get your final CR. If you understood all that, this is the same process. We're just adding a little more complexity because we might give the monster some special things that will influence its effective hit points for figuring defensive CR or its effective armor class for figuring defensive CR. We might give it traits that affect its effective damage output, which is going to affect offensive CR, things like that. So, if you're making a really simple monster that doesn't have these traits, then you're just going to go through the creating a quick monster stats process and you're going to be pretty much done. But if you're creating a monster that has some of these traits on page 280 and 281, things like damage resistances, magic resistance, invisibility, things like that, then it may, and actually invisibility does not impact your challenge rating. A lot of these on here don't. So when you look on this table, you'll see a lot of these don't have an effect on challenge rating, but some of them do. And this table will tell you what impact it has. So yeah, a very common question here is about creating legendary monsters and what does that do, especially taking an existing monster and making a legendary version of it. And how's that going to affect the CR? So the main ways that that's going to affect the CR is the legendary actions that it has, as well as the lair actions that it has, will most likely increase its damage output because a lot of times it can do legendary actions that are attacks. So you're going to factor those into the damage output per round, and that's going to increase its offensive challenge rating. And then it's probably also going to have legendary resistance, and that will impact the defensive challenge rating. It's going to increase its effective hit points, which is going to increase its defensive challenge rating. So those are the main ways that legendary are going to impact CR, and they're both going to increase it based on what the monster started out with. And yeah, that's it. We made it. This was kind of long, but not as long as it could have been. So I'm happy that we got through this, and hopefully this makes sense to you, especially put together with the last episode in this series where we talked about the quick monster stats. I still think it would be kind of fun to get together with Brett on here and maybe go through this process with a monster that we create. So if you have an idea of a cool monster we could create using this process as an example to kind of illustrate to you how this works in practice, shoot me an email at dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. And if someone throws out a really great idea that we really like, we might just do that. So barring that, next up in this series, or you know what? Did I miss something? Hang on. Let me make sure I didn't miss something here. You know what? Actually, there's a couple more things here that I should just get out of the way now, because it's not enough to do a whole episode on. So let's power through this. NPC stat blocks. Appendix B of the Monster Manual contains stat blocks for common NPC archetypes like bandits and guards and whatnot. As well as tips for customizing them. Those tips include adding racial traits from the player's handbook, equipping NPCs with magic items, and swapping armor, weapons, and spells. If you want to make an NPC stat block and adapt it for a specific monster race, apply the ability modifiers and add the features listed in the NPC features table. If the NPC's armor class, hit points, attack bonus, or damage changes, recalculate its CR rating. And on the flip side, if those things don't change, then you can assume it doesn't affect the CR. So this might be something like taking the bandit and saying this bandit is an elf. So you would apply the elf racial bonuses and whatnot to the bandit. So it'd get +2 to its dexterity. It'd get dark vision, immunity to sleep spells, things like that. And then you would decide, does any of that change the armor class, hit points, attack bonus, or damage? If it does, then it might impact the CR and you can calculate that. If not, then you can assume that the CR is the same. Creating NPCs from scratch. If you need completely new stats for an NPC, you have two options. You can create an NPC stat block, similar to the ones in the Monster Manual, as you would a monster stat block, as we've just discussed, and just go through that process. Or you can build the NPC as you would a player character, as discussed in the PHP. Don't do that. I don't even know why they have that as an option here. If you do that, you're not doing yourself any favors. The only way I would ever recommend making a player character for an NPC is if, for some reason, you have a player that is going to join the campaign in a few game sessions, but you're going to play their character as an NPC until then sure, have them make the character and use that. But even then, personally, I would make an NPC stat block for that character and use that. I wouldn't use the player character sheet because most of that information you're not going to need. But that's the only instance I could think where it would be a smart idea to use a player character for an NPC. Use an NPC stat block, put anything that you need to run that NPC in that stat block or in the text that goes with it and call it done. You don't want to make a player character for an NPC. Yeah, it's just that way lies madness. You're just going to bog yourself down during the game, and there's no upside to it at all, other than if you're a DM that just really wants to play and you can get the fun of creating a player character. And if that's the case, just find a game to play in and make your own player character. Do everyone a favor. Don't run PCs in your game because they're for players. That's why they're called player characters. All right. So yeah, they're going to talk about a little bit about that. So we're going to skip that because I'm advising you don't do that. The NPC features table summarizes the ability modifiers and features of the various non-human races, as well as various creatures from the Monster Manual, with a challenge rater lower than 1. So you can apply those modifiers. Monsters with classes. So you could use the rules in Chapter 3 of the Player's Handbook to give class levels to a monster. For example, you can turn an ordinary werewolf into a werewolf with 4 levels of the barbarian class. So what you would do if you wanted to do that, let's say maybe you want to take a dragon and give it levels in wizard or sorcerer or something. So you'd start with the monster stat block, and then the monster gains all the class features for every class level you give it, with the following exceptions. It does not gain the starting equipment of the class. For each class level you add, the monster gains 1 hit die, but it gets a hit die of its normal type. So it doesn't get hit dice based on the class. So if we're talking a monster that has a D8 hit die based on its size, so it's a medium monster, and you give it levels in wizard, those levels in wizard give it more D8 hit dice. They don't give it D6 hit dice like the wizard. So that's one way that monsters are different than player characters, is their hit dice will always be based on their size and not on whatever class you give them. And then the monster's proficiency bonus is based on its challenge rating, not its class levels. So the only way adding classes to a monster is going to increase its proficiency bonus is if those adding those class levels give it abilities that are going to increase either its damage output, its offensive CR, or increase its defensive CR, in which case the proficiency bonus will be based on the new CR. So, let's say, for example, go back to the table on page 274, the monster stats by CR. Let's say I have a level 10 monster and I'm going to give it, I don't know, levels in fighter or whatever I give it. And that results in it having ways to do more damage than it did as just a CR10 monster. And I refigure its CR and it turns out that now it's a CR, let's say now it's a CR 13 instead of CR 10. Well, I look at the proficiency bonus, and a CR 10 monster has a +4 proficiency bonus, while a CR 13 monster has a +5 proficiency bonus. So my monster's proficiency bonus went up by 1. But otherwise, if the CR doesn't change, or if the CR doesn't change enough to change its proficiency bonus, then the bonus stays the same. So those are the three things that the three exceptions to what the monster gets from the class. So it doesn't get the starting equipment. It gets its own hit dice, whatever that is, instead of whatever the class would give it. And the proficiency bonus is still based on the monster CR, not the level in the class that it has. So once you finish adding class levels to the monster, feel free to tweak its ability scores as you see fit. For example, raising the monster's intelligence score so that the monster is a more effective wizard, and make whatever other adjustments are needed. And then once you're done with all that, recalculate its challenge rating. Depending on the monster and the number of class levels you add to it, its challenge rating might change very little, or it might increase dramatically. For example, a werewolf that gains 4 levels in Barbarian is a much greater threat than it was before. It's going to do more damage, and it's going to have probably better defensive. So it's going to raise its defensive and its offensive CR, which means the overall CR, which is an average of the two, is going to go up. So yeah, giving a hobgoblin 4 levels giving a werewolf 4 levels of barbarian is going to increase its CR. In contrast, the hit point spells and other class features that an ancient red dragon gains from 5 levels of wizard aren't going to increase its challenge rating. And I think if you look at what a 5th level wizard gets compared to what an ancient red dragon can do, the only thing that's really relevant there is the spells that a 5th level wizard gets. And they're getting at most 3rd level spells, and that's not going to compare damage wise to what an ancient red dragon is doing with its breath weapon and its physical attacks. So it's not going to increase the CR at all. And I think if you look at that makes sense. All right. And now we're done. So next time, we will be talking about creating a spell. And then after that, creating a magic item, and then creating new character options, things like races and sub-races, modifying classes, creating new backgrounds. And yeah, then we'll be, that'll be the end of chapter 9 actually. And then we'll be into the appendices. So yeah, that's what's coming up. We're getting really close to wrapping up the DMG. So I hope that this discussion was helpful to you today. And please, if you have any questions about this, let me know. dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. I'd be happy to revisit this topic and answer questions if there are things that are tripping people up, or specific examples that are confusing you, or anything like that. Let me know, and I'd be happy to discuss it on the show. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 278 of Dungeon Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarwalker, and you can call my voicemail and leave a message, 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. And finally, you can join us on our communities on MeWe and Discord. You can find links to those in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Dungeon Master's Journey. If you would like to support the show, you can visit starwalkerstudios.com/support and see all the easy peasy ways that you can do that. I even have some things for you that won't cost you anything, like my Amazon referral link that you can use to shop on Amazon and will help me out a lot. Other great ways to support the show are to purchase some of my D&D supplements. Again, my latest supplement, Adventures of Primordia, is currently 20% off, and you can currently get 10% off of the bundle of all three of my D&D supplements. And you can find those at starwalkerstudios.com. And finally, you can become a patron of the show, and you can find a link to my Patreon at starwalkerstudios.com as well. So I hope that you have a chance to play some D&D this week. I hope you have a chance to run some D&D. I'll be back soon with another episode of Dungeon Master's Journey. Until then, go build some monsters.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.